Well, hello, everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. We are going to do a deep dive into thought leadership at the Rady School of Management at UC San Diego. And we have with us today a star faculty member whose expertise is in experimental design and economics. We'll be talking about Rady's innovative Gen AI assisted curriculum and business analytics, among other things. But let me introduce our guest today first. Professor Anya Samek is an associate professor of economics and strategy at the Rady School of Management. She's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. She joined Rady in 2020 from the University of Southern California. She has count them, three degrees from Purdue University, including her PhD, her MS, and a BS in economics, as well as a BA in French literature. She did her postdoc training at the University of Chicago. And in 2020, the same year she joined Rady, she won a very prestigious prize. She was awarded the Vernon Smith Ascending Scholar Prize. She has published over 60 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and they have appeared in many popular media outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR, and one of my favorite podcasts, Freakonomics. So welcome, Anya.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So you traded the novels of Victor Hugo for the economic theories of Gary Becker and Herbert Simon. Why?
So I actually didn't take any economics as a high school student. I didn't take my first econ course until college, and I kind of stumbled into it. So I've always really been interested in decision making, what makes people make the choices that they make. And one thing that's great about economics is it's all about decision making under uncertainty and under constraints, trying to understand how people make those decisions using mathematical approaches was really interesting to me. So I think this is really kind of at the core of what we think of as economics, ties in very closely to business analytics. So how businesses make decisions, humans are at the core of all businesses.
And how have you used your grounding in economics to basically fuel your research interest?
So what we try to do is use economic theories to predict the decisions that people make in the real world. And we think about many of these theories as going across contexts. So if you think about why someone might sign up for the gym, but then the next day actually fail to show up, miss the deadline to sign up for health insurance, miss a class project deadline, or procrastinate until the last minute, all of these types of decisions can be explained by theories of procrastination and present bias. And so we can think about these theories as applying to real concepts, but then the question is, how do you then evaluate whether your theories are right? And that's where experiments come in. So we use experiments, we go in the field, we present people with different decision problems, or we observe people in decision problems, and then we try to see whether the behavior that we observe matches up with the theories from econ that we develop.
So you come at this from a behavioral economics standpoint.
That's right. So I worked with Steve Levitt, one of the authors of Freakonomics, back in the day at the University of Chicago. I think behavioral economics is really important because in standard econ models, we assume that people have full information and are fully rational, and so we can really predict decisions in a really rational, simple way. But it turns out that a lot of those theories don't pan out in the field. So we go out and we try to figure out, if you sign up for the gym, you should be going every day because you're paying the money to be there, but you're not. And so that's where the behavioral component comes in, is we can think about, well, how do we adjust the models of standard econ to account for the fact that people don't necessarily understand all the information that they're given, don't necessarily make rational decisions every single time, have emotions, have biases, and so on. And so there, I think these models are better suited to explain different phenomena that we observe.
Right. Now, how is economics related to and tied to business analytics?
Well, business analytics is all about coming up with data that would allow firms to make decisions that are data-driven. And so I always explain it in my class as, we have a lot of data. We now collect so much data on all sorts of behaviors, human behavior, and so on. firms have this data, governments have this data, you can access a lot of the data, but all of the data, most of the data that we observe is correlational data. So two variables move at the same time. And when you have correlational data, it's actually hard to make a business decision from that. So imagine you change something in your business, like you change the design of your website, and then you observe more kind of purchasing on the website. But it's not entirely clear that the web design actually drove that change. It could be something else in the environment. Like maybe you're an e-commerce site and you change the design right around Christmas time when people are shopping a lot more. And so some other variable could be coming in and affecting the results that you see. When we use experiments, we actually identify causality. So we're able to say, let's run an experiment now, randomly assign some people to get one version of the website and others to see a different version. And we could do that really easily online. And then now we have the causal impact of the website on sales. So when we make a future decision about web redesign, we can reference that data, that's causal data, to make those decisions. And so business analytics is all about data-driven decisions, and the data you need often comes from experiments.
Right. And you're an expert at designing these experiences. Can you give us an example?
Sure. So some years ago, I worked with Google. Google was really interested in corporate social responsibility, so helping the employees to donate more to charity. So they have a program in which they match one-to-one donations to any charity of your choice for an employee of Google. They call them Googlers. So Googler makes a $100 contribution to, say, the local Humane Society, and then Google will match it one-to-one. So Google will send $100 on the behalf of the employee. They really want to encourage these matching gifts. And the thing is, people aren't taking as much advantage of them as they should. So what Google was experimenting with is this idea of perhaps having a direct donation made to a charity of your choice through your payroll. So instead of having to find the charity, go to the website, put in your credit card, make the donation, contact Google to confirm the donation so they can do this match, they wanted a program that would allow you to do that more instantly. So now through the intranet at Google, you could press a button and say, next month, I want $100 of my paycheck to be deducted to be given to the Humane Society. And then Google will make the automatic match. And so they were interested in, will doing that change, will that increase donations by Googlers? And instead of just rolling it out across the board, we ran it as an experiment, because what we really wanted to do is understand what's actually the causal impact of that change on donations. So the way we did the experiment is we just randomly assigned Googlers to either receive this opportunity for the direct donation or not. And we did it based on the last digit of your employee number. So if it was odd, you got one treatment. If it was even, you got another. And so because we have nothing else that's different across the two groups besides the last digit of their ID, which is random, we can assume both groups are similar on all other dimensions. Like we have the same number of very generous people in both groups. We have the same proportion of women versus men in both groups, and so on. And so that's really important. We isolate the variable of interest. And then we find that donations go up a lot. So when you can do this approach through the direct donation, you get many more people that are willing to donate to the charity that we selected for them. And we think that's because the econ theory for that would be a theory of hassle costs. So people don't like to experience things that create this hassle cost. Like I got to go to a website, I got to put in my credit card, I'm just going to skip it all together. And so we reduce the hassle cost and therefore increase giving. So we published that paper. They had done this in small pilots, and then eventually they rolled it out a large scale. So for that, I worked together with some employees of Google to run that experiment. But that's one example where you can see that's helpful because we could get really like the causal impact of the program before rolling it out at a larger scale.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I know that employers increasingly demand business analytics skills from the students that they hire, right?
That's right. Yep. So now we have a lot of students who come out of our Masters of Business Analytics program that go on to do experiments at the firms that they are employed. So for example, now Walmart does a lot of experiments. Uber and Lyft have been doing a lot of experiments for years. A lot of the experiments, rather than testing different programs, are testing things like pricing. So how should I price a ride from the Rady School of Management to the airport? How should I think about say a ride was late and I want to retain my riders, how do I come up with the right coupon to send them to get them to come back to Uber or to Lyft after they've experienced kind of a negative experience, and so on. So all of these things can be manipulated. Other experiments, for example, at Uber and Lyft, things like what should be the suggested tip amount? Should we even put suggested tip amounts on there? So when you ride on these platforms, you can see sometimes it looks different, and that's because they're experimenting on you all the time. So firms are really increasingly turning toward using experiments and business analytics to drive their decision making.
Yeah, fascinating. At Rady, what are the most essential courses in this field?
So in the business analytics field, experiments in firms, the course that I teach is one of the most essential. And for this very reason, that we really teach the students how to design an experiment, how to think about human behavior. We introduce a lot of behavioral economics theories in there, and then how to generate the data from the experiment and really understand how to use that data to then make a decision. So I think of it as combining the science of being able to design a good experiment, being able to analyze the data, with the art or kind of the managerial expertise of being able to know what to do with the data that you get. And that's where those come together for the business analytics major.
And that sounds to me like a slightly different approach than many other schools take, where they're just teaching you how to take a lot of data and try to make sense of it. This whole notion of designing experiments to decide which way is better or more efficient, more effective, it seems to be a real lens that Rady is using to study business analytics.
Yeah, so really, we have a core set of faculty who teach experiments and have this background in behavioral economics at Rady. And so a lot of our programs have that component. So we teach this course as well as a core course in the undergraduate program. It's a really important course in the MBA program. We really think of ourselves as experts in that field.
That's great. Now, what kinds of hands-on experience are students given in developing and running these experiments? I imagine that maybe you have some assignments from organizations that are trying to innovate in this area.
So for the MSBA program, the quarter system is 10 weeks. So we don't really have the time to embed you in a firm and get you to run experiments. But what we do is we assign you to do a pilot experiment in a group of 3 or 4 people. And you can choose any topic of your choice. And some of our students have either worked full-time in the past or are currently involved with an organization. Maybe it's in a volunteer basis. And so they're able to harness that connection to design the experiment. So some of our students definitely are doing experiments as part of kind of other things they're involved in. For example, I had a student last year who was involved very heavily in a veterans organization that was fundraising. And so they were able to use the warm list of 3,000 donors that they had who were regularly donating money to this veterans organization and run an experiment where they sent different emails to people, some of which had stories of how veterans were helped by the donation and others which didn't. And then they analyzed the impact of different solicitation techniques on donor behavior. So in the hope that in the future, this organization could use those learnings to send the most impactful solicitations for donations.
Now, I know you're teaching your design course right now to executive MBA students. Obviously, MBAs have more work experience than traditional MBAs or even master's students in business analytics. And I wonder what kind of projects they may be doing right now with you.
It's a good question. We have a group who is actually executives who are working at the Rady School of Management who are very interested in an EDI, so issues of diversity, and they're interested in coming up with different emails to get people engaged in diversity initiatives. That's one project that they've run. We are actually about halfway through our quarter right now, so I haven't checked kind of where the different groups are at with some of their projects. But I did have some students who were very innovative last quarter who were interested in looking for internships for the summer. And what they did is they ran an experiment on LinkedIn, and they were interested in what kind of messages would get CEOs on LinkedIn to be more willing to be engaged with them in their search for jobs. And this is a really important question. We have a lot of papers actually in the economics literature on mentoring and diversity in the labor market, and these questions of who are the types of people that when they reach out to a CEO actually get a call back. And so what is it about women versus men or minorities versus whites that gets them a call back more or less often? So this is actually an area of research. What they were interested in is just looking at whether having a more specific ask about being interested in that person's company versus just saying that they're interested generally in that field, in the field of finance, which one would get the CEO to be more likely to respond. And they must have sent hundreds of emails where they randomized the message, came from the same person, they randomized the message, and they looked to see the response rates. So in my experiment class, the response rate is what I'm looking for. And then you need to analyze to see which of your treatments generates the higher response. And then kind of the business analytics answer to this is like, what are the ways that which we can improve labor market outcomes for people? Like what kinds of emails should you be sending out? That's sort of the impact component. But as a result of this, these students actually managed to get a bunch of interviews with CEOs and got internships through doing that experiment. So they do find that the specific ask is more impactful, and then they go on to actually leverage that in their internship search, which can be helpful for later employment.
Right. Now, Anya, you gave good examples earlier on how Google used experiments in business analytics to determine how to deeper engage its employees in philanthropic support, and then how Walmart used it for pricing. I wonder, are there some other ways that companies can make decisions using analytics that you teach in your class, either through a case study or a project?
Well, let me think of a good one. Another kind of project that I've been involved in also has to do with social responsibility. So we were looking at fundraising and trying to understand whether different fundraising practices that fundraisers consider essential are actually effective at retaining donors. And so one particular tool that fundraisers have been using for years and consultants to fundraisers have been telling them is really important is a personal thank you call following an initial donation. So in the literature on charitable giving, the retention rate of a new donor is about 30%. That means a charity could try really hard to generate new donors, but at the end of the day, the likelihood that donor is going to give again is only 30%. It's quite low. So they're trying to raise that 30% number. How do you retain that person that kind of gave a one-time donation and now I've sent them a bunch of emails, a bunch of letters? And so this idea of the personal thank you call is, let's say you, John, make a donation of $100 to San Diego Public Radio, and then they personally call you and say, hey, thank you so much for making this donation. It really is really helpful for us. You feel really good about yourself, and then potentially you're more likely to give again next year when we ask you for a donation. And so this has been going on. Mid to large size nonprofits tend to use this a lot, and they tend to actually pay people to make the calls. So this isn't a volunteer or kind of the board member making the calls. It's a person that's being paid by national public television or public radio. And what we wanted to look at is, do these calls really increase retention rates of donors? And we worked with 70 public television stations and a large health nonprofit where we ran experiments. And so all we did is they were regularly doing the calls. We held 10% of the new donors back from receiving the calls and at random. And so we had a random group that got the calls, random group that didn't. And then we look at donor retention in year 1, we look at it in year 2, year 3, year 4. We look at these two groups, which are similar in all ways, except one was randomized not to get the call. Do they look different? So is there a causal impact of these calls on donor behavior later on? We also survey many fundraisers, about 200 fundraisers. We survey them. We say, we ran this experiment. What do you think should be the impact of the call? Because there's a question about, if we have experts, fundraiser experts, who tell us what they think, and if that's correct, we may not need an experiment. We may just be able to use expert opinion. So the expert opinion is that these calls should increase retention up to 50% on average. So from 30% to 50% because you've been called. What we then observe, though, when we run the experiment is absolutely no effect on any dimension. So there's not a
Wow.
No difference in retention, no difference in donation amount, whether it's a year out or 2 years out or 3 years out, the calls don't seem to make a difference on retention. Now, where the calls are useful is if you pick up the phone and you have a positive engagement, you're more likely to give again in the future, but that's not because you got the call. It's more likely because you're the type of person who would have given anyway. And so you could use these calls to segment donors, but you shouldn't think that these calls are effective for increasing donor retention. And over the course of the study, the organizations we worked with spent about $500,000 on calls. They were making them anyway, so it wasn't the cost of the experiment. But the experiment really showed, look, you shouldn't make these calls if you're making them for donor retention because they don't have that effect. That was an interesting project. I got a lot of pushback from fundraisers who didn't believe me and said, well, maybe if you made the calls in a different way or at a different time,
That's what I was thinking.
people. And I've responded to all of those requests saying, look, I'd love to run an experiment in your organization. And I have yet to get, because I'm open, like I'm a scientist, I will interpret the data and believe it. So I've yet to take up on that. I think people are worried. They've been running these for tens of years and don't want to find out they don't work. But that's what we found in that study. So these studies are really ideally change the behavior of the firms. And in this case, the firms we worked with stopped doing the calls. A lot of other firms are still skeptical.
I wondered if you were able to isolate introverts and extroverts by a Myers-Briggs test and saw the results from an extrovert who might be more naturally engaging with a donor than an introvert who may be slightly more awkward. And if in fact there would be a difference between the two, that could be a fun little experiment. And someone should take you up on that.
Right. So here, actually, I like that you raised that point because there are different ways to run experiments, and we have expertise in all of them at Rady. One of those is these field studies. So in the field experiment, or kind of the experiment in the firm, I don't get to survey people. I'm not getting to get personality information on people, right? Because we typically run these experiments in a way that people don't even know they're in one. So anytime you take an Uber or a Lyft ride or you shop at Walmart, you're probably in an experiment and you don't know. But the other way to run experiments is what we call a lab experiment. So there you bring people to a lab and then you put them in kind of a abstract scenario and you try to get them to make decisions on a computer with anonymous other people. And there you can collect personality data, you can collect all sorts of kind of data on someone and then really get a deep dive into the psychology of decision making. We often combine the two. So we often will have a field study where we see behavior in the world, behavior kind of with a firm, and then to understand mechanisms, we might go to the lab and say, look, we think the mechanism is through this introvert or extrovert. Let's test that. So let's put people in kind of a hypothetical donation scenario. We give you $10. We say, how much of that $10 do you want to give to this charity? And then collect a bunch of other data on you. So there you know you're in a study. We get lots of data on you, but we kind of figure out what is it that makes people tick. So I really like kind of the range of different experimentation approaches. We can combine the methods to get a big picture of what's going on.
Yep. Now, AI has been the rage, and I wonder how the advent of AI and how it's evolving is affecting the way you design an experiment and affecting business analytics in general.
Yeah, so I think AI is really exciting. A lot of firms are thinking about incorporating AI into their systems. And I don't incorporate, I think it's important when you teach to still make sure people are understanding concepts. And so I've switched a lot of my evaluation to in-person, no computers, because I want to make sure people get the fundamental concepts. Because in order to evaluate how AI is designing an experiment or interpreting the results of an experiment, whether it's correct, whether it could be better, you really need to have the foundation. But what I do is encourage people to use experiments that incorporate AI, and people are really excited about this. And so I've had students do projects in the last year where they look at the impact of an AI doing an advertisement versus a person, and then they go on Facebook and they post different ads and they see what the engagement is with the two ads. I've had people do different resumes. So I do one resume, which is AI, and I do another one that I wrote myself, and then I send it out to firms and see which one is going to give me the callback. So I think these are all really interesting. My own view on this is I think there's a lot of heterogeneity, and heterogeneity means a lot of differences by type of person. So if I'm someone that writes really well, AI is going to potentially hurt me. And if I'm someone who really struggles to write, AI is going to help me. So it's not a one size fits all kind of situation. And I know
Yeah.
firms are using AI for things like thinking about using AI for things like doing reports, like reports on employees, doing different kind of communications. And I think testing it is really important. You could think about the impact of AI on something like bias. And on the one hand, maybe AI is less biased, but on the other hand, maybe it picks up on bias that humans have and becomes more biased. And so these are questions that have to be tested with experiments. And this is why when my students come to me and say, look, I want to design an experiment where an AI is going to write my resume versus me, and I'm going to test it, they usually think the AI is going to be better because this is so exciting, this new technology. And then in some cases, it's worse. It really depends on the context. It depends on the quality of what prompt you give and so on. And so this allows our students to engage with AI just as it's emerging, which is all very exciting, and to design these experiments and really see what is the impact of the AI.
I imagine the tricky thing is that this is a technology that's evolving and evolving fast. And so what it can do today isn't what it will be able to do in 2 years or 3 years, when it's possible that many tasks performed by AI could be superior to a task performed by a human, right?
Yeah, so I was talking about this to someone at a firm recently and thinking about if we have humans doing some task, like say evaluating an employee and then giving them feedback, and then you have an AI doing this, and we want to think about metrics, design metrics for things like bias, um, things like accuracy, and then think about the metric for accuracy or bias of an AI versus a human. And so this would be similar to my sister actually works in self-driving cars. She's an engineer. So they design the self-driving car software, and there's some threshold at which errors are all right. So we want to think about the errors humans make versus the errors these self-driving cars make sure the cars are better than the humans, but not necessarily that the cars are at 100%. And so you could think about AI in similar terms. So if we're thinking about AI designing communication tools, it needs to be better than a human, I think. We want to think about when it makes a mistake, how bad that mistake is for someone, like if it's an employee being evaluated and so on. And we're going to think
Right.
about these things and having the metrics as AI evolved, you can keep applying these metrics over time and really use those to understand when to use AI and when AI might not be the best idea. Another area people are interested in right now that do experiments, we just had a person come out and give a talk on this, another professor, is how people respond to AI. So it's one thing to say, look, AI is much better, but it's another to say, look, now instead of my boss sending me an email, they're actually sending me an AI email. Do I respond to that in the same way? How does that make me feel if I get an award, but the person awarding it is an AI instead of a human? Like, is that gonna reduce? It seems to in the talk I just listened to, it seems to reduce interaction a bit. So people are less excited about arguing with an AI or kind of getting feedback from an AI. So this is another question: is how do humans respond to the AI? That's ultimately important too.
Fascinating. Now, earlier in the Google example, obviously Google was trying to employ business analytics in your experiments for social good. And I wonder to what extent do you feel obligated, and maybe your colleagues feel obligated, to prepare students to use these skills for the good of society as opposed to flat profit maximization and the destruction of our planet?
That's a really good question. So I also do a lot of research on food choice and making people make healthier choices. I also work with kids in school lunchrooms, trying to figure out how to design school lunchrooms to help kids make healthier choices. And all my research is for the betterment of decision making and kind of improving health. And then for every one of me, there's 50 people at the company that makes the kind of the unhealthy food, trying to figure out how to get people to eat more of it. And so it's definitely a challenge. And actually, I always incorporate kind of these ideas about ethics and the social good in my classes, because that's where my research interests also are. And I think a lot of our faculty do as well. So we're very interested in helping people make better decisions, making sure that we are considering consumer welfare. And we talk a lot about consumer welfare, like what makes you worse off versus better off. So this is definitely an important area of research, because ultimately, if you can create value for customers, that's when they buy your product. So you want to create value. And that has to be a customer-centric approach no matter what.
So no business analytics to determine how to get consumers to buy more supersized sugar drinks.
I mean, definitely people can use it for that. Yeah.
Of
So
course, it's true. So
then you need the policymaker, the future policymakers in our classes to tax those sugar sweetened beverages. That's pretty
right,
important.
that's
How
right.
we,
So,
how we
so Anya, is
do
there
that.
one particular experiment in your research efforts that you're particularly excited about right now that we'll see in a future study?
Yeah, so we had a project that we ran together with actually colleagues at Chicago, including Steve Levitt, the author of Freakonomics, in 2010, where we are looking at what in economics we'd call the production function of education, but in lay terms, that would be just what types of early childhood programs help kids from lower income disadvantaged areas to do better, to graduate high school, to go on to get jobs. And so we're really interested in human capital development. And so as part of that, we ran this large scale experiment with 2,000 households in the south side of Chicago, this low income area of Chicago, where we randomly assigned some families to receive different educational programs. And one of those was a free full day preschool. And one of them was a parenting program that we called the Parent Academy. So the Parent Academy, the parents came in twice a month to learn how to teach to their kids. And all the kids were 3, 4, and 5 years old. So really young kids before formal schooling, trying to figure out how to get these kids to perform as well as their counterparts who are from richer areas of town. So these kids were underperforming at the time that we got them into our program. And we see some short-term impact of these programs on kids doing better in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then the effects fade out a bit. And now our kids are in high school, so they're almost ready to graduate high school. And I have gotten an NIH grant, a large one, to follow them over time. So we have a lot of measures on these kids and their parents over a long period of time. And one project that we're nearly done with is looking at the impact on these kids of COVID. And so if you knew about COVID, schools closed down. So we saw what we call COVID learning loss. A lot of kids dropped in their standardized test scores from before COVID to after. And this affected most lower income kids, because these are kids whose parents did not have the resources to get them a tutor or to get them a learning pod or really to do anything, maybe not even have time to help them get on Zoom to work on their homework. And so what we're actually looking at is the causal impact of this parenting program from 10 years ago, or now 15 years ago, on parents' ability to scaffold these kids' learning during COVID. And we actually see that kids who were randomized 10 years ago to their parents getting this parenting program for a year are less likely to exhibit that COVID learning loss compared to our control group that didn't get it. So in a sense, that early childhood programs have a lasting impact on helping kids weather shocks. And so I work a lot in schools. We consider working in schools as kind of another policy application of experiments. But that's one that I'm very excited about because it really highlights the importance of parents in the education production function and the importance of families as a whole in helping kids to thrive.
And looking at your CV and seeing the different studies that you've authored or co-authored, it occurred to me that this is an area, meaning childhood education, that's very important to you personally.
Well, I would say that I'm really interested in motivating people to do things that are better for them and for the betterment of society. And that kind of goes into education, it goes into health and food choice, physical activity, and charitable giving as well. So getting people to donate more to charity, to have more money kind of to help those that are in need. These definitely make up a large part of the work that I do.
Fantastic. Anya, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Very nice talking to you.
All right. We've been speaking with Anya Samek, who is an associate professor of economics and strategy at the Rady School of Management at UC San Diego. She's an expert in experimental design and economics. And as you've heard, she's doing it for social good. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.